Welcome to our presentation this evening on News You Can Trust. It's presented by me, Amanda Burbridge. Those letters MLIS mean Masters in Library and Information Sciences. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But for now, thank you for joining me this evening to talk about news and misinformation. Just really quick, a reminder and a little push. If you are not participating in our adult summer reading, you've still got a few weeks to do that. It ends on August the 8th. So you can sign up at kirkwoodpubliclibrary.org. If you are doing summer reading or if you want to, there is a challenge that gets you a raffle ticket if you attend an event, which is what you're doing right now. So if you want to do that challenge and get credit for attending this event, your code word that it's going to ask for is WILD, W-I-L-D as in wildlife, and that will get you that raffle ticket. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer those, or you can give the library a call and we'll get you set up for that. So let's get started. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so first, what does trust mean for the purposes of this presentation? So we'll start off with a discussion of this. Webster Dictionary, as you can see, defines it as assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or trust of someone or something, or one in which confidence is placed. So I really appreciate that they use the word confidence instead of faith, because faith kind of, refers to something a little deeper, right? Confidence instead captures an idea that's more just, you trust in something, but it's still fallible. So even when you do trust something, you generally kind of keep your eyes open, right? And that's the attitude that I encourage you to keep when we're talking about trust and looking at news sources. So some sources are going to be more trustworthy than others, but all of them sometimes get it wrong. So to put it another way, reading the news is a little bit like going to the doctor. So usually you have a high level of trust in your doctor. They're trained, maybe you've been seeing them for a while. They have access to your records, all of that helps them. But if they prescribe a new treatment plan for you, you're probably going to ask a few questions. You still trust them, but you just want to make sure that it's the best plan for you and that you understand what they're saying. So even when you're reading news sources that you feel like you can trust, it's the same way. You still might want to ask a few more questions, and I'll help you with what those questions are in a little bit. So first, who am I and why should you care about anything that I have to say about reading the news? So that's me hiking. I like to hike. And like I said at the beginning, MLIS stands for Masters in Library and Information Science. That means that I am a professional librarian, meaning that I have that master's degree and libraries are my career. I completed my degree about 5 years ago. I've worked in libraries for over 10 years. And that has been a wide variety of settings. So I've worked in public libraries, I did a university position, and then I also have worked as a private company librarian and archivist. So I have a pretty broad experience. And a key part of that master's in library and information science means that I've taken classes that focus on what we call information literacy. So basically that means teaching people how to pick out reliable resources. Also in with that, the library community has some pretty strict ethical codes. And being both truthful and impartial are pretty big pieces of that. Finally, I have education and experience, and one of the biggest parts of my job is research. So there's special training on that as well. So I am specially trained, I'm committed to being impartial, and I do my research, and that's some of the things that we'll be looking for when we look about news sources as well. One more thing before I get to the heart of the class. I want this presentation to be as meaningful and as useful as possible, so I'm not going to shy away from any hot topics of the day. It would be really boring if the only examples that I used were about school board elections or things like that. Not to mention that many of the concepts that you need to watch out for get more prevalent when we're talking about highly contested topics like healthcare and policy reform and social movements. So journalists are much more likely to use sensational language when they're covering a terrorist attack than when they're reporting the weather. That said, we might get into some things in this discussion that you have strong opinions about. I certainly encourage questions. However, please make sure that if you have a question or a comment that you're being respectful of me and your fellow attendees. If I think the question is focused on starting a debate, then I reserve the right to steer us back in the right direction. If you do want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just hop in whenever I take a pause. Otherwise, you can use that raise hand feature in Zoom to get my attention, hopefully, if I'm looking. Okay, so I am going to be basing the rest of this class on these 6 key points. And after the class, quite possibly tomorrow morning, I'm going to be following up with an email to all of you that signed up. And that will have a version of this graphic with some more detail. It'll have all of my sources that I'm using this evening. And I'll also share a recording of the class so you can refer back to it and back to this infographic whenever you might need it. So take heart that you will be able to refer to this later. And I'll go over each of these in a lot more detail, but here's kind of a quick rundown of the tools that we use to spot misinformation. So the first is headlines. You always want to be careful making assumptions based on just the headline that you see. Next is sources. So a good news article will reference reliable sources and subject experts. The next is author. So if they're sharing personal opinions, you want to check who the author is and what their credentials are. Next, we've got publishing date. So you want to pay attention to when it will be published. And then you also want to take a look at the purpose. So the purpose of the article, is it satire, is it opinion? And then finally, bias is the big one. So we'll talk about how to spot bias and how to think about your own bias as well. Come on. Okay, so hopping right in, we'll talk about headlines. As it says here, if the headline sounds too good or bad to be true, it probably is. And here's that famous picture with the example of the Chicago newspaper misreporting the election many years ago. So headlines are not always trustworthy, as you can see. Most people know this, but it does bear repeating over and over. The headline is not the full story. And often the headline can be kind of misleading or sensational in order to get your attention. And unfortunately, in today's kind of digital culture, we often don't have time to read the full article. So my advice is that if you're not able to read everything, always take that headline with a whole grain, a whole pile of salt. Like it says on the previous slide, if it does sound too good or too bad to be true, it might not be. So let's talk more about that. One of the ways that headlines work is by harnessing your feelings, because the media knows that your feelings affect the way that you read the news. A study recently published in Cognitive Research even found a link between heightened emotions and the likelihood of you believing dubious or outright fake news. Beyond that, if you Google emotion and memory, a quick search will get you a lot of sources that link the two of those, that we remember things better when we have an emotional response. So journalists like to harness that. And it can really play into how we're consuming our news and how headlines can set the tone for the news that we're consuming. Before I give you the answers on how to spot problems in headlines, I'm going to show some examples and we will see if you can pick up on some of the things to watch out for. So diving right into controversial topics, here's an article about gun laws. Do you have any reactions? Does anybody see anything that might be problematic or concerning in this headline? And you can either put that in the chat or you can unmute yourself or you can make me sit here in silence.
It uses the word force and talking about paying fees.
There you go. So that's a big one. Force is really one of the things that you want to look out for, strong emotional words. So I've had the benefit of reading the full article, which you have not. But as you saw, talking about paying fees is another big thing because that causes, a gut reaction in a lot of people. So there's a definite connotation to the word force, right? People make laws all the time. So technically you're forced to buy car insurance to like lawfully drive your car, or you're forced to wear clothes when you go out in public. But when you apply the word force to a hot button issue like this, it kind of makes you mad. How dare they force me to get insurance? But when we read deeper into the article, there were two things that I gleaned. First of all, the idea is in its early stages. So, they're still having a lot of discussions about how it would work, what the fees would be, who's going to take those fees, what would they be for. Secondly, and most importantly, participation would actually be on an honor system because they don't have a gun registry of any sort in California. So they can't technically force anybody to do anything. So that's a good example of how, you can kind of set an emotional tone when the full story is quite a bit different. So here's the next one. Any thoughts on this more recent news publication? Jumping straight into politics just in case. Well, I'll give you a spoiler on this one. And part of the problem with this is that reading the article is really what points out the problem. There's a very blunt fact that's stated in this headline, and it hadn't actually happened yet. And what really was fascinating about this news is that I found multiple headlines from a lot of typically, sort of in good, reputable news sources that were along the same lines, that everybody was reporting it the same way, stating that all of the Republicans had been pulled from this committee, when in fact, they often backtracked and used softer language in the article. So the very first sentence of this particular article says that the House GOP leader says he will pull all 5 of his picks to serve on the committee if the House Speaker doesn't rescind her rejection of 2 of the picks. So it says this thing has happened. He's pulled everybody from the committee when really it's just a threat that has been said. Beyond that, it's not even something that can happen, and not all the Republicans could be pulled from the committee because some of them had been nominated by Pelosi herself. So it causes this sensational, bold statement and then kind of backtracks. So actually, as a good example, a more neutral news source reporting on the same story had the headline, Pelosi rejects 2 GOP nominees for the January 6th panel, citing integrity. So that just says what happened. She's rejected the picks and somebody made a threat, but we can't report on that yet because it hasn't actually happened. So how can you, expanding on these examples, what do we look for when we're looking at headlines? So as the Jedi would say first, learn to be mindful of your feelings. Many of the studies that I read talked about the importance of just slowing down and thinking very deliberately. So when you see a headline, recognize that there's an emotion that comes out first, and then think about why you paid attention. What made you click on it? Is it something you're passionate about? Do you perceive it as really good or really bad? The first step of noticing and thinking deliberately is being mindful and noticing that you have a reaction. Then, as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, the best tool that you have is to read the whole article. It's essential to get all the facts. If you can't read the whole thing, and this is one of the most strong statements I'll make all night, if you can't skim it or you can't read it and you only have time to glance at the headline, do not under any circumstances share it on social media or use that headline as an argument, because 9 times out of 10, you do not have the full story. As we've talked about, keep an eye out for emotional language and sensational language. Language is one of the strongest tools in a journalist's arsenal to get you to read their news and to get you to react. So choosing words with emotional weight will really help their impact, but can also do damage to the way that you are consuming the news. You should also beware of any out of context quotes. So like in this example, extremist proposal is a very strong sentiment no matter what, but there's likely more context to be had there. And so this headline itself looks very alarming, but it's taking like one or two more word phrases out of probably a much longer sentiment that was said. Finally, one handy tool that you can use when you're looking at headlines is try and look at the headline and then rewrite it in your head, taking out some of that emotional language. So for example, if you see a headline that says First Step Act snubs some drug offenders, you can walk that back and think in your head, the First Step Act doesn't apply to all drug sentences, which is what was happening in that news. As I said, feel free to hop in at any time, unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have, or there will be time that I'll pause at the end and answer some more questions then as well. So moving right on into sources, Neil is telling us that we all need to cite our sources because that's very important. And you're only as good as the links that you have. So where did that source come from? Journalists, unfortunately, can't know everything, so they need sources for anything that's not an opinion of their own. This is the most basic way to evaluate an article. Anything that's not opinion should be sourced unless the author is an expert. So sometimes it'll kind of be like a nonfiction book or like an article where there's additional resources at the bottom. That's a good place to check for sources. Most of the time now, what we're seeing is that news articles online will casually share their sources using in-text links. And I actually really like this a lot. Some of them do it where if you hover over the word, it will kind of pop up and tell you where it came from. Some of them you do have to click. I've neglected to mention this at the beginning. I'm focusing mostly in this class on online resources just because that's kind of where a lot of us are consuming our news these days. But if you are reading an article online and you see some words in the text that are different colors, go ahead and click on those. If you're curious about the source, or if you think it sounds kind of odd, or you'd just like to learn more about it. Those different colored words are usually linked and they will take you to the source that the author is citing there so that you can learn more. In most cases, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but primary sources are preferable. So what I mean by that is in the context of news, we're talking about data-based sources or eyewitness accounts, visual evidence, expert opinions, things like that that are kind of straight from the source rather than getting it from another news outlet, for example. As it says here, first person witnesses, experts, that sort of thing. So this is where you get to go through 2 years of library school in about 10 minutes here. How do librarians evaluate sources? So as I said just now, direct sources are always preferred. So you want to cut out as many middlemen as possible. Data sets are great if they're easy to read. Sometimes they can be a little bit confusing. Peer-reviewed articles, so something that says the Journal of, Cognitive Research or whatever, those are also excellent, where it's been reviewed by other experts and they've given it the okay as good research. Those can also be a little bit dense, so you might have to proceed with caution with those. Essentially what you don't want in an article is second or third hand information. So I recently in researching this class was looking at a news article and the only sources that they had cited were other news outlets, Psychology Today or Scientific American. So patching other people's news together is not really news, especially if the intent of the original article gets lost. It's sort of like a game of telephone. So the message, the more it's interpreted and the more it's repeated, can really get garbled. So if you have an article that's only saying, well, the Wall Street Journal said this, then you might want to proceed with caution on that source. There are also certain organizations that we as librarians look to and consider trustworthy in general. A basic librarian rule of thumb is that a .org or a .gov website is far more trustworthy than a .com. Not saying that .coms, aren't trustworthy, but it's usually a good indicator if it has a .org that it is a more trustworthy source. Mayo Clinic is a good example here. So they're a well-respected medical institution focused on research, trusted in the health community, and their website is mayoclinic.org. Government sites are also considered trustworthy, which is a little difficult for some folks. But in general, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the National Institute of Health, the Census Bureau, the IRS, the CDC, these are also considered trustworthy. And I know I said a name that is not very popular right now, but I did that on purpose. So no matter what social issues are going on, the CDC is an organization that's focused on impartial research. They're concerned with public health. They're governed by experts, and they employ checks and balances in their system. So as an information professional, I still confidently point to them as a good source of information. Speaking of experts, expertise is also very important. So who is an expert? I could go on for a long time about this because it's gotten kind of confused in recent years, but basically an expert is anybody with relevant education and experience. So this doesn't mean that they're infallible, but it does mean that they're far more qualified than you or I to register an opinion on the matter. So if you're looking at healthcare news or specifically COVID news, you want to look for a doctor that's been consulted about it, particularly somebody that specializes in virology, if it's COVID, or disease, infectious disease, something like that. If you're reading about economic policy, you want an expert who's studied economics. Talking about climate change, you want an environmental expert. You get the picture. So these are, people who have studied the field and who have made it their life's work to speak about this. Did you have a question, Carla?
Sometimes we have experts who say completely different things.
That is absolutely true. And I mean, you're kind of seeing that a lot because every once in a while, like with, COVID things, you'll get a doctor that says something different. I'll get into that. We kind of touch on that in bias a little bit. What I would generally say, and this, I know for some folks is going to sound out of touch, I guess, the majority is a good marker to go off of. So if you've got 10 doctors that say one thing and one doctor that says something different, I would go with the 10 doctors. And of course, we've always got whistleblowers and things like that happen, but most of the time, the general opinion is going to be the one that is more trustworthy. In science especially, I talk about this a little later, I lean towards people who hedge their statements. So it's always been good practice to recognize being fallible, essentially. So if you've got somebody who's saying, yeah, this is mostly effective and we're learning more every day, that's considered more trustworthy than someone who says this is terrible for you and you shouldn't do it. Like, that being balanced and trying to mitigate bias and give more information rather than less is a good sign that the person or the source is more trustworthy. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Vertical nodding.
Yeah, or someone who says, who gives you both sides of it, who
Right.
gives you some information. That's what I've looked at.
Yeah. Aha, watch out for bias. So in a little bit, we'll go over a lot more about spotting bias in a news article, but you should also keep an eye on it in sources. Generally, if you're following the criteria above, you shouldn't find too much bias. So if you're going for, established organizations and experts and that sort of thing, still, I would stay vigilant for sensational language and interpretation of facts. And this next one is a real big librarian trick. And this actually goes for both, root sources and news organizations. But it's a common practice to look at their about page on their website, and almost everybody has one. Sometimes it's, really easy and accessible up in their menu on their website. Sometimes you have to scroll all the way to the bottom into the footer where it's got like the contact information and all that little stuff. There should be a page that says info or about us or what we do or something like that. And that can be extremely helpful in figuring out who they are, what the point is, what they want to accomplish, and sometimes even will outright state a bias. So as I was doing research, the page for the news organization National Review explicitly says National Review was founded in 1955 as a conservative news source. So that will tell you they are a conservative news. Other times it can just tell you what their purpose is or the integrity of the organization. So the website Healthline tells you in their about page that they work with medical professionals who fact check all of their articles and give expert review. So that can kind of help you determine who they are, what they do, how they get their news, that kind of thing. Finally, sources should be current. So most scholars will tell you that a source within about 5 years is your best bet. When it comes to like scientific medical things, 3 to 5 years is a lot closer to it. So anybody who's citing a source that's like 20 years old, unless it's like history, is probably, you should be cautious about that they may be twisting facts that have potentially been discovered to be untrue since then. All right, so authors, you want to ask who this guy is and why you should be listening to him, which is exactly why I told you who I am at the beginning here. So qualifications matter. And this is a quick one. It's tied pretty closely to sources, but it is important. So I wanted to give it its own slide. Like I said just a minute ago, most of your articles are written by journalists. And they are news experts, which is fine. When that happens, though, you should be keeping an eye out for opinion versus fact. So if they're writing an opinion piece, well, anybody can have an opinion. But if it's being presented as fact, they need to have credible sources unless they themselves are an expert, which they might be. Some news sources will get, so-and-so from Johns Hopkins to come write a guest article for them. And if that's the case, it should probably say it up at the top of the article in the byline. So you can check that byline for clues. Sometimes up at the top of the article, it'll say, Amanda Berberich, Master in Library Science, and tell you what their job title is or what their qualifications are. Some might even note if there's a political affiliation for the author. This usually only happens in like fact-checking websites, but it is very useful when that does happen. If that's not the case, if it doesn't say who they are or what they do, you can dig around some more, and I will show you where to dig around on this page. Here's a few examples of different news articles and how they do their authors. So surprisingly, BuzzFeed is not always the most trustworthy or unbiased source, but they actually did a really good job of saying, here is the person and here's their job title. So this is Claudia and she is a BuzzFeed news reporter. You can see that right under her name. And in this one, and also in the next example, you can't, all of the authors' names often on these online sources are linked. So you can click on them and see what else the author has written and sometimes more information about the author. So I'm going to show you this one from NBC News as well. And this one is written by Erica. It doesn't say anything about her or who she is, but if you click on that link, it tells you that she's a health, oops. No, thank you. It tells you that she is a health and medical news reporter. And this website is going to be really nasty to me. Okay, well, that's fine. It tells you she's a health and medical news reporter. And then it says, you know, here's all the other stuff that she's written about health and medical news. So since NBC is being sassy to me, we're going to go right over to NPR, which is my honorable mention because they do an excellent job of talking about their authors. You see up here that there are 2 contributors to this article. And if you click on their name, it tells you everything about them. And I love this. So it says here is, you know, her job title. She reports on health policy for NPR. Here's all of her, you know, experience. Here's her education. Here's what she's interested in. She lives in Washington, D.C. You know, it gives you a whole profile on this person and then also tells you what other articles that they've written. So I love this because it gives you a great picture of the author and who they are. So you can tell, again, kind of how trustworthy they are and get a good idea on what their qualifications are and why they would be writing this article. In this case, she writes on health policy, and so she's writing about breakthrough COVID cases. So I'm going to find myself back where I was in my presentation. Here we go. Okay, so that's authors. Next, we've got dates, which is another pretty quick one, but bears mentioning. It's really good. I have that little joke about, you know, only the truly famous get to die twice. So it's really important when you're reading news articles to check the publishing date. And the reason that I made that joke about dying more than once is that there's a good likelihood that if you use social media, you've seen this happen with death notices. It is happening possibly less frequently, but was very rampant for a while there that, you know, you'll see somebody share that a favorite author or an actor has died, and then you click on the article and it turns out that they've actually been gone for several years now, but that person just now discovered it and is sharing it as if it's new. And this happens in news as well. And it comes into play a lot with politics sometimes, especially in the years that are close to a transfer of power. So in those cases, even a completely true story can take on an entirely different meaning. Around 2017, this is an example that sometimes gets used about the Ford vehicle company. Around 2017, articles started going around talking about Ford moving its operations from Mexico to the United States. And the claim was that, you know, that was linked to the new Trump presidency, that it was moving manufacturing back into the US. If you followed the news trail, though, it turns out that that actually happened back in 2015 before the election. So in this example, we see that telephone effect where news sites start to quote other news sites, and all of a sudden this old story is new again, but it takes on new meaning because now it's politically relevant instead of just a business news story. For a more recent example, as I was doing some research, I found this headline, and I found it very surprising. A growing share of Americans say that they plan to get a COVID vaccine, and 77% think that it's beneficial for the economy. And I was surprised because of some of that hesitancy that we've been seeing, right? But then I looked closer and I saw that the actual publishing date was March the 5th, which is pretty early on in the vaccine cycle and kind of before a lot of the hesitancy took hold. So this is another good lesson in being careful with headlines. And also just, you know, making sure if there is a date, check on that. If it is breaking news, it's probably pretty fresh. But otherwise, always be careful to pay attention to those publishing dates and make sure that it's actually new information. All right, so the intent of the article is another thing that you have to watch out for, because opinions are in fact not just personal facts. And you have to make sure that the article is meant to inform you and it's not just an opinion. So what's the point of that article? So just to review, facts are very different from opinions. Factual articles, you can identify those because they've got sources, they're sharing hard data, they've got expert input. And if you're not seeing a lot of those citations or source links, it's probably just an opinion piece, or it probably should be an opinion piece, which is fine. But you just need to take that for what it is. And the way that you see that ideally is that it will be labeled clearly. You want to look for words like opinion, editorial, analysis, perspectives, commentary, things like that, that label it as this is somebody speaking with their opinion. They're extrapolating facts, but it's not necessarily just the facts here. Often if you are, and those are signs to proceed with caution. If you are on the source page of the news website, you may see a header that says opinion, so you can clearly identify those. Otherwise, it should be noted in the text of the article. And it's also important to note that many sites do both opinion and straight reporting. So, even just because you're on NPR's website doesn't necessarily mean that you're not looking at an opinion piece, because most of them will have, editorials and things like that. So just to show you, here's a few examples of how websites notate this. So this one, will say opinion on Joe Biden. This one says analysis. And this is a great pairing because you can see this headline that says, "This is the most unhinged Trump rant about the 2020 election," which is very biased and has a lot of spin, but you can also see that it's an analysis. So they've labeled that as, okay, guys, this is where our bias can flow freely. And so we're going to put this really biased headline out there. This one says commentary, and then NBC has theirs listed as, think pieces. Unfortunately, one of the other important things to note is that some websites are just always false. They call themselves Satire. I can't pass judgment on this. I can appreciate the attempt at humor, but it is important to know the major names so that you can be on guard and so that you're not fooled, especially when the articles sound plausible. Additionally, many of them do take it a little bit too far by having a tongue-in-cheek headline that says, like, your trusted news source, or things like that. This is where I'll remind you of what I said for headlines as well. So if it seems outrageous, there's a good chance that it might not actually be true. So the first one is possibly the most famous that you need to watch out for is The Onion. It's been around for a long time. It's a well-known satire site. And some of their articles look deceptively real. So as you can see here, they had an article called "How Organizers Plan to Keep the Tokyo Olympics Safe." Unfortunately, things in their slideshow included athletes have to wash their hands at least once, or police will apprehend anyone with symptoms, things like that are definitely not true. But the article itself looks like it might be true. So if someone took that seriously, it could get out of hand very quickly. So if you ever see anything that's from The Onion, it is false. Babylon Bee is another one to look out for. And they started out doing specifically religious news, but have recently, in the last couple of years, kind of forayed into conservative politics. So you can see here, FBI discovers building full of dangerous extremists. Haha, they're talking about the FBI itself. So that, it's not true. It's satire. It's meant as a joke. But the headline is perfectly primed to cause panic if taken seriously. So the B is also a thing to look out for. One more that is fairly common is called clickhole. This one is a little bit more obvious about being satire. It actually took me a little bit to find a headline that sounded convincing. But just, have that name in your head that if you see an article from clickhole, it's meant as a joke. It's supposed to be satire. and do not take it seriously. Finally, and a little bit less funny, look out for sites that are mimicking other reputable sites. So there's been a growing phenomenon of sites with odd web extensions. So instead of .com, it will be .co or something like that, and they will add that on. So you'll see a web address that's like abcnews.com.co. So it looks very convincing, and it very closely mimics a real actual news site, but it is not true. At the end of this presentation, I'll share a resource. There is a list online of known fake news sites, and I'll send that out with the presentation notes as well. All right, so finally, we'll talk about bias. You should trust your gut, but you should also be wary of it. And just know that media bias does exist. It's everywhere, it's unavoidable. And part of that is because bias is everywhere. It's one of the most difficult hurdles that we face in choosing good news sources. And it doesn't help that it's a well-established fact that the news evokes strong feelings from people. So as we talked about at the beginning of class, you know, emotions are very strongly linked to how we consume our news. And the news, unfortunately, involves things we feel strongly about: politics, religion, money, social issues. So before I get into ways to identify your bias and looking for ways around them, I'm going to tell you a story about me and how I choose what to eat for dinner. So loved ones sometimes tease me about my decision-making habits, because a lot of times when I'm having trouble making a decision, I will narrow it down to a couple choices and I'll say, which one do you want? And it is completely arbitrary in their eyes on whether I take their advice or not. So if I, for example, I say, do you want sushi or Mexican tonight? And my long-suffering husband says, well, how about sushi? I may or may not actually go for that. And that's because it sets off an emotional reaction. I might react positively, almost like relief. And then we go and we eat sushi. But if I feel disappointed by that answer, then it turns out I actually really wanted Mexican food and he just gave me the wrong answer. But I didn't know it was the wrong answer until that's the answer that I got. A coin flip works for this as well, but it's a lot more fun to frustrate your friends and family. So reading the news is similar to picking a restaurant. How you feel has a lot of influence on how you read, and you can learn to recognize those feelings of validation or relief versus those feelings of disappointment or consternation. And that can help you realize when you're caught in an echo chamber and help you to get out of it. So like I said, the truth is everyone has bias. I have it, you have it, and a large number of news outlets have it to varying degrees. The good news is that it exists on both sides, pretty much in equal measure. So it's, you know, despite some claims, you know, it's not that all of the media leans left or leans right or whatever. There's a pretty solid distribution of people on either side. So depending on where you look, it can pretty much balance out. You just need to learn how to see it in order to counteract it. So what are the easiest ways to identify? There's a growing theme that emotions are a really big way to identify that bias. So I said earlier that sensational language is really common in contested topics, but the reality is that it also pops up everywhere. You know, one of the notable examples that I like to give is the weather. So here in St. Louis, we have really hot and humid summers, and I hate that weather. It is not nice to me. So on the occasion that I'm watching the news on TV and the weather person is giving their report, and they'll show a week full of like high 80s, and they'll say, we have a really beautiful week coming up. And that really frustrates me because they're taking a fact, which is that Thursday's high will be 87, and they're mixing it with opinion, which is that Thursday will be a beautiful day. So that beautiful day is the emotional language that turns the weather into a biased report. So that brings to my next interpreter of bias or marker of bias is interpretation of facts. So anytime that the author takes a fact and puts an interpretation on it, there's a good chance for bias to creep in. Now, news stories will almost always interpret the facts because otherwise it's a really boring story. You just have to be careful on how closely they're interpreting and that they're not making far-fetched conclusions. So a good example for this, and I don't know that anyone's reported on this, but is that like in the 2020 census, one of the results of that is that Texas is gaining 2 seats in the House of Representatives. So that's the fact. Texas will gain 2 seats in the House of Representatives. If somebody reported on it and said that Texas will have an opportunity to have a stronger influence in the House, that's a decent interpretation. But if somebody reported on it and said that Texas will be taking the House by storm, that's too far, and it leans towards bias because you're taking a fact and you are putting a strong interpretation on it and attempting to get an emotional response. It's probably pretty obvious that making accusations is a sign of bias. So clearly, if you are blaming something on a certain political figure, that's a clear bias. But also, I'll make a point for strong statements. So as I said earlier, with with Carla's question, if somebody is saying something, and it's a very strong statement, they're not really hedging it at all, and they're blaming one thing on another, or they're saying this is the truth. And I mean, some things obviously are just the truth. But when that happens, proceed cautiously. So as I said, you take the vaccines as an example, and that's another very heated topic, but some of the best articles I've read about the vaccines state the facts and also acknowledge concerns. So they neither say that absolutely everyone needs to go out and get a shot right now, nor do they, spread misinformation about overblown, side effects or anything like that. But they say, essentially that things that we can determine by data, that they've been rigorously tested as much as possible, that they're an important part of the recovery process, but that they're not infallible and we are still learning. So balanced reporting and not making accusations or strong statements is a really key part of building trust. So that brings to our next point, that sometimes bias comes out in what does or does not get reported on. So if your news source tends to report on every Republican misstep, but they completely ignored when the Democratic governor of New York was blamed for sexual misconduct, then that's biased reporting. They're only bad-mouthing one side and they kind of ignore the blunders of another side. If they cover a speech by the former president and they're only talking about part of what was said, whether it's the bad things or the good things, that's also biased reporting. Finally, another key tool is pictures. So paying attention to photos. This is extremely important in politics, though it comes up in other things too. More often than not, stories about political figures are accompanied by a photo that sets a tone with a facial expression. And these photos are going to illustrate this really well. So for example, this picture from the left kind of has a facial expression that's a little bit goofy. You don't have a lot of confidence in that person. Whether or not you had confidence in them or not before is beside the point. But this photo shows you someone who looks doubtful. They look like they're maybe saying something aggressive. This photo from the right has more of a smug facial expression. This person knows what they're talking about. And in fact, they're giving, this sort of side eye to their opponent. This photo, on the other hand, is perfect and I love it. So it's a completely neutral facial expression. It's neither negative nor positive. And this is an article from the Center. So that kind of illustrates that sometimes bias comes in even just in the photos that accompany. And again, going back to this theme, visual cues are very important in setting an emotional tone. So reporters use that as another way to sort of set your mood before you even read anything that they write. And with all of the, oops, go ahead.
I'm sorry, is this is clicking a bell with me. Is there some site that does left, right, and center?
Yes, we're about to talk about
it.
Yeah. And so I took these from, I'll talk in just a minute about All Sides, which is one of my favorite resources for looking at the news. So combating bias, and, you know, keeping in mind everything that I just talked about, these are all ways to be mindful. So bias is inescapable. And knowing how to combat bias is just a tool in your arsenal to be a better news consumer. So knowing is half the battle. You're here learning about bias. And knowing your own biases can help you in overcoming them. So if you start to tune into your inner dialogue, and let it guide the way that you read, it will really help. If you find yourself, you know, nodding emphatically the whole time or reading with disgust, maybe consider reading something from the other side and comparing the two coverages. It is tempting to only read news sources that align with what you believe, but I challenge you to look from different angles and see how it kind of rounds out your perception. Which brings me to the second part, that it's also important to know the biases of your news outlets. And like I just said, I will talk about a really good resource for figuring that out in just a second. So choosing your sources well is also very important, and learning which ones to steer clear of. So if a certain source consistently uses sensationalism, misleading or alarming headlines, minimal sources, opinionated reporting, that kind of thing, it's probably best to avoid that source if you can. Even if you are a little bit more comfortable reading sources that align with your beliefs, it's good to try to pick one that has a lean instead of an outright bias, right? Or try to get one that's more towards the center. So finally, your other tool for combating bias is to look at the other side. So we'll talk in a sec about All Sides that kind of helps you figure out what the other side is saying, but try to find coverage of the same topic from a source that you normally would not look at and see what they have to say. And just as a word of heartening, you know, this is not new. We've dealt with media bias forever. I found a lot of examples, not great ones to put in the slide, but, you know, as I searched for media bias throughout history, you know, it's always been a thing. But the good news is we're in a position now with these resources to see it and to overcome it, because we have more information at our fingertips. So All Sides is one of my absolute favorite ways to get my news. If you're on social media, they have a Facebook page, and that is the only news Facebook that I follow. And the really unique thing about them, as you can see, they have a media bias chart. I like the way that they determine their media bias. So they do blind testing with consumers. They'll give you, you know, like a line from an article and say, which way do you think this leans? They're constantly updating this chart. They do studies all the time. They take feedback all the time. They keep an eye on how the news articles are evolving. And this is a link that I will give you in those notes as well, that you can, so that you can get to their page. So as you can see, there's this chart here. When they report on things, they do like a row of 3. So there's one from the left, one from the right, and one from the center. So you can see how the different places side by side are reporting on that news article, so that you can see it all right there and kind of see how the bias leans. So they provide multiple perspectives. They also have educational stuff. So there is an article that's in my notes about how to spot media bias that's a lot more detailed than I could get in this presentation. They have a tool to check your own bias, which is great. You know, they'll kind of ask how you feel about certain things and give you an indicator on how they think your bias might be leaning. So yeah, All Sides I really, really appreciate as far as places that help you figure out what the bias is. Fact checkers are also really important. Add this to the list of people who are not infallible, all sides included, but they do serve as a tool that can clarify when things might be false and what to look out for. So a few that I have found that are pretty trustworthy are PolitiFact, factcheck.org, and Snopes is another one. Snopes does a lot more with like social media hoaxes. So that's a really great, if you see something on social media and you're like, what? That can't be true. Snopes is a good place to check because they cover like fake photos and things like that. The other two do a little bit more with like news claims or false claims on social media, not necessarily pictures though. But yeah, all of these will, they usually lay out the reasoning that they have for the true or the false rating. And that really helps with figuring out what the problem is, and that can kind of help you also educate yourself gradually on what to look out for. And other news sites will also do fact checks. It's just not quite as regular. So I've seen them come out from USA Today or Reuters or things like that. So if you're on, a news site, they may have a section for fact checking as well. And then finally, as I said earlier, Wikipedia has a list of fake news sites that will also be in my notes, the link for that. So if you ever see something and you think, wow, that's kind of unbelievable, you can check that fake news site and see, or you can check that list and see if maybe the site that it's coming from has been determined to be fake news. All right. Any questions? I talked for quite a bit, but anything I didn't cover or anything that you're still curious about or issues that you've run into that you want to talk about?
I found it interesting that the all sides, that there's some of those places that are in two different columns.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I was going to mention that. And so one of the things that I do really like is that you'll see that they separate out for some news and opinions. I think Wall Street Journal is one where like the news they say is typically more center, but the opinion tends to be right. And that's where, it's a good illustration of why it's important to notice if it's an opinion piece. Because then sometimes, a place where I would typically send people for news like NPR or Wall Street Journal, if it's an opinion piece, there is going to be more of a biased spin to it.
The other question I had, so many times I see quotes by certain people and they'll put a picture of someone. Is there a specific site that is really good to look up and verify, did this person really say that?
Snopes might be a good source for that because they do tend to debunk a lot of the social media images. I can't say that for sure. Probably what I would do, honestly, with my master's degree in Googling, is Google it. So you can just put, a few words of the quote and then the person's name. And you should be able to find, and that's where you can kind of employ some of the, okay, what's, in that process, what's a good source? Because there still could be, we're starting to get into this age of what they call a deep fake, where, they put out something that's not true, and then they also create a back trail for it. So it can be really hard to debunk some things. So you still want to kind of be cognizant of whether it's a good source that you're looking at to verify the quote. But if you can find multiple, that's where you can also do the whole multiple sources thing, are more than one person, can I find more than one source that says that this is actually true?